There is a kind of stubbornness that doesn't look like strength from the outside. It looks like a woman alone in a field, pulling fence posts from ground that hasn't thawed properly, doing it anyway, because the alternative is losing the only thing her father left her that still had her name on it. Joanna Crest had been doing that kind of work since she was 19. She was 28 now, and the work had not gotten lighter. The property sat 12 kilometers east of Pincher Creek, Alberta, on a shallow bench above the Oldman River, 160 acres of mixed grass and coulee country that her father, Douglas Crest, had worked for 31 years before his heart gave out on a Tuesday morning in March, midway through calving season, with his boots still on. He had not left debt. He had not left savings. He had left Joanna the land, the equipment, 2 aging quarter horses, and a gate latch that needed replacing, which she had not yet gotten to. The cattle were gone. She had sold them the previous October, 43 head at a price that would have made her father sit down and not speak for a full minute. To cover the property taxes and the repair on the well pump that had seized in August, the math had been simple and brutal. Sell the herd or lose the land. She had chosen the land. What she had left was a fenced line that needed 3 weeks of work, and a hay crop she could not harvest alone, and a kitchen window that let in enough wind that she slept in her barn coat from October through April. She was replacing a rotted post on the east quarter when she heard the truck. It came in from the main road without hurry, a dark green 3/4 ton with a stock trailer empty behind it. She did not recognize the truck. She recognized the Rockcroft brand on the door panel, a stylized R over a quarter circle, because everyone in that part of southern Alberta recognized the Rockcroft brand. You recognized it the way you recognized the name on a courthouse, not because you had business there, but because it was large enough that its presence shaped the landscape around it. The truck stopped 30 meters from where she was working. The man who stepped out was perhaps 50. With the particular economy of movement that comes from spending decades making physical work efficient rather than impressive. He wore a canvas work coat, no hat, and he looked at the fence line before he looked at her. Joanna set down the post driver and waited. "Post's going in crooked," he said, not unkindly, stating a fact. "The ground's heaved. I'm working around it." He looked at the line of posts she had already set, then back at the one she was working. She watched him do the calculation, which he did not share with her. Leland Rockcroft, he said. She knew the name. 43,000 acres across 2 municipalities, grazing leases on Crown land from here to the Montana border, a family that had been in the foothills since before the provinces existed. His grandfather had trailed cattle north from Wyoming in 1897. His father had expanded through the dry years of the 30s by being careful when everyone else was desperate. Leland had turned what he inherited into something larger still, without any apparent display of effort. Joanna Crest, he nodded once. He had known that already. In a county this size, he would have known who owned every quarter section within 50 kilometers of his fence line. "You're Douglas Crest's daughter." "I am." "Good man," Leland said. He meant it. It was not the empty condolence of someone filling silence it. He said it the way you say something true about someone you actually knew. He looked toward the river bench. The grass was winter pale and matted, but the land lay clean beneath it. No standing water in the low spots, no erosion cutting along the coulee edges. Her father had taken care of this land, and the land showed it. "You're running the operation alone." It was not quite a question. She answered it anyway. Managing it alone. Running requires a herd. He absorbed that without comment. Then he walked to the fence line, not asking permission, and crouched at the post she had been fighting with. He looked at the base, the heave line in the soil, the angle she had been compensating for. "You'll need to go 6 inches deeper on this side and bank it." She knew that. She had been about to do exactly that before he arrived. "I was getting there." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, exactly. Recognition. He stood and looked north along her fence toward where it met his lease boundary. a long straight line of posts that had been solid work when her father set them, and were beginning to show their age in the way good work eventually does. "That line needs attention before spring turnout," he said. "I'm aware. What are you planning to do with the land this season?" Joanna looked at him steadily. She was not naive about how these conversations started. She had watched it happen to 2 other families on the bench in the past 3 years, a conversation that began with a fence line or a water source and ended with a signed transfer and a for sale sign by the road. "I'm planning to keep it." Leland looked at her without expression for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm not here to buy your quarter. You haven't said why you are here." "Fair enough." He nodded at that. He put his hands in his coat pockets and turned to look at the river valley below. The same view her father had looked at every morning for 30 years. "I run 340th head through this bench in May and June. I've been routing them 2 kilometers east to avoid your north gate since Douglas passed because I didn't want to trouble you." He paused. "That's adding a day and a half to the move, and my cattle are losing condition on the detour." He turned back to her. "I'd like to use the north gate and trail a section of your land for 6 weeks, spring and fall. I'll pay fair lease rate for the access. I'll supply the crew to repair your east fence line before May, and I'll put a new pump on the stock well at the property line." He let that sit. "Hear the rest before you answer." She heard the rest. He laid it out the way a careful man lays out a business proposal, clearly without ornament, with the specific numbers already calculated. The lease rate was above fair. The fence repair would take her 3 weeks alone or 4 days with his crew. The pump would cost her more than she currently had liquid. In exchange, access across the north quarter 6 weeks twice a year, cattle movement only. No permanent easement, written agreement, termination clause if his cattle damaged her water sources. He had already thought about the termination clause before she asked. "Why not just offer to buy the parcel?" Joanna asked. "That's what families with your name do." He looked at the field behind her, at the post she had been fighting into heaved ground since before he arrived, at the fence line that showed 3 decades of her father's consistent, patient work. "Because you haven't listed it," he said. "And a person who's been pulling posts since dawn in April isn't doing that because they're undecided." Something shifted in her chest. Not warmth, not yet, but the particular feeling of being seen accurately by someone who had no reason to look that carefully. "In writing," she said, "with a clause that your crew repairs to the existing standard, not below it." He pulled a worn notebook from his coat pocket and wrote the clause on the hood of his truck, right there, with a pen that had seen better years. She read it twice. Then she said, "I'll want the pump specs in advance. I'm not accepting equipment that'll need replacement in 3 seasons." "That's reasonable," he said. "And I pull my own gate. Your crew doesn't operate the north access without me present or someone I've designated." He wrote that down too. She signed the agreement with the pen that had written it, standing at the hood of his truck on a cold April morning with the wind coming up from the river. He signed below her name 2 copies. She did not feel relieved. She felt for the first time in 8 months like the situation was manageable. Those are different things, and Joanna Crest had learned to know the difference. The crew arrived on a Monday. 4 men in a flatbed with materials she would not have been able to source at that price, and a 5th who turned out to be the operator for the post driver, which saved her 2 days of handwork on the frozen sections. The foreman was a quiet Métis man named Aldrich, who looked at her east fence line and then looked at her and said, without preamble, "You've been maintaining this alone since last March." He nodded in a way that meant he understood exactly what that represented. She worked the line with them. She did not stand back and supervise. Aldrich watched her take up a post bar on the second section and made no comment, which she understood as its own form of acceptance. By the 3rd day, they were working with the easy coordination of people who have figured out each other's rhythm without needing to discuss it. On the 4th afternoon, she found that a section she had measured for 5 posts needed 6. The ground had dropped slightly at the coulee edge. She had not caught it in her pre-season survey. She went to the flatbed and pulled the extra post herself without saying anything about it. Aldrich saw her and did not say anything either, which was the right response. Leland arrived on the 5th day, not to supervise. His crew did not need supervising, but to check a section of the fence where it ran along a seasonal drainage that he had noted in his own survey. He found Joanna at the same drainage, making the same observation. "It backs up in June," she said. "My father boxed it with rock, but the frame shifted 2 winters ago. I saw that. We can reset it while we have the equipment here." She looked at him. "That section isn't in the agreement." "No," he said, "but if it fails in June, it's my cattle that push through your fence." She considered that. It was both true and not the full reason, and they both understood that without saying so. "Leave the rock pattern my father used," she said. He had a reason for the overlap. Leland looked at the existing structure. He could see the reason immediately. The overlapping placement slowed water velocity before it reached the frame. It was practical knowledge that lived in observation rather than textbooks. "I'll tell Aldrich," he said. That evening she walked the repaired fence line with a flashlight, checking every post and joint. The work was solid. Better than solid, in places. Aldrich's crew had used a post depth she would not have had the equipment to achieve alone, which would hold through the frost heave cycles for 20 years rather than 10. She went back to the house and sat at the kitchen table with her father's operations ledger open in front of her. She had been keeping entries in it since March, continuing his system, his column headers, his notation style. It felt less like bookkeeping and more like a conversation she was maintaining with someone who could no longer answer. She wrote the entry for the fence repair, and the pump installation, and the lease terms. Then she sat for a while longer. She was not out of difficulty. One good business arrangement did not change the underlying arithmetic of running 160 acres without capital or crew, but the fence would hold, the well would work. The north gate would bring in enough to cover the property taxes without selling equipment she could not replace. She could see spring from here. She had not been able to say that in October. What she did not see was what was waiting at the edge of it. His name was Clifford Brack, and he arrived on a Thursday morning in the 2nd week of May with a car that was too clean for this road and a briefcase that belonged in a city office, which it usually was. He worked for a numbered company out of Calgary that bought agricultural land and converted it to holding parcels for developers who were, in turn, waiting for the municipal boundary extensions that everyone in the county knew were coming, but no one had signed off on yet. He had been through this county before. Most people did not know that. Joanna knew it because her father had written it in the operations ledger 4 years ago. Brack, May 14th, offered 30 per acre below assessed. Said it was fair. It wasn't. Told him so, he left. Douglas Crest had written it plainly, the way he wrote everything, and Joanna had read it the way she read everything in that ledger, carefully, as information she might need. Brack did not know about the ledger. Most people who came offering to buy did not account for what the previous owner had written down. "I've been authorized to present a serious offer," he said, standing at her gate with his briefcase and his clean car and a smile that had practiced itself into something that resembled sincerity. "The market's moving. This is a good time to consider your options." "The property is under lease," Joanna said. "Grazing access and water rights through October signed and registered with the county." The smile did not leave, it recalibrated. "Leases can be addressed," Brack said. "That's not unusual. The important thing is that you understand what the land is worth to the right buyer, which is considerably more than what a grazing lease returns." She looked at him. "Leaseholder is Leland Rockcroft," she said. A pause. Brief, but there. "I'm aware," Brack said. "Leases are paper, Miss Crest, and the registered holder being a large operator doesn't change the underlying offer or your right to consider it." He tucked his document case under his arm with the easy confidence of a man who had said this before and found it effective. "I'll be back Wednesday. I'd encourage you to think seriously about what I've said." He drove out. Joanna watched his car raise dust on the gravel road. Then she went inside and wrote in the ledger, Brack, May 9th. Offer declined verbally. Implied lease is not an obstacle. Wednesday. Call Rockcroft. She sent a message to Leland that same afternoon. He arrived Tuesday evening with Aldrich and one other hand, quietly, without the kind of arrival that announces itself as a response to a threat. He found Joanna at the kitchen table with the ledger open, and her father's notes on Brack's previous visit laid flat beside her current entry. He sat across from her. He read her father's note without being invited to. He read her entry. He came to your father too, he said. 4 years ago. Dad wrote it down. Leland looked at the handwriting, Douglas Crest's careful, deliberate columns. Something moved through his expression that was not quite readable but was not nothing. Brack works for a company that's been positioning ahead of the Highway 3 corridor extension, he said. They've taken 11 parcels in this county in 3 years. 7 of them were women whose husbands had died within the previous 2 years. Joanna had suspected something like that. Hearing it said plainly was different from suspecting it. He'll come with riders Wednesday, she said. It was not a question, probably. Leland looked at her. He won't come with anything he can be charged for. He'll stay inside the law and outside decency, which is how he operates. I'm not hiding in the house while he's at my gate. Leland looked at her for a long, even moment. I haven't asked you to, he said. Wednesday came cold and clear with a north wind that had come down overnight and was not planning to leave. Brack arrived at 10 in the morning with 2 men whose manner was not aggressive enough to constitute a threat and not casual enough to be anything else. They stayed on their side of the gate. Leland stood at the gate. Aldrich stood behind his left shoulder. Joanna stood to Leland's right, 3 paces, her father's operations ledger in her hand, not as a weapon, but as documentation. Everything Brack said today was going in it. Brack took in the configuration and adjusted his approach without letting the adjustment show. Rockcroft, he said. Didn't expect to see you personally. I check my lease access personally, Leland said. This gate is part of my registered agreement. What happens here is my business. Brack looked at Joanna, at the ledger, at Aldrich, who had the particular stillness of a person with no nervousness about the situation whatsoever. Miss Crest, Brack said, and his voice had gone into a lower register that was supposed to feel like privacy between the two of them. The offer is $2,000 an acre. That's significantly above assessed. The lease doesn't change what the land could do for you. The land is doing exactly what I need it to do, Joanna said. Her voice went across the cold morning without effort, no performance in it. The offer was declined Monday when you were here. It's declined now. It'll be declined Wednesday next week and the one after, and the county land office has a copy of your previous visit here 4 years ago and a note about the methods your company uses in distressed estate situations. She held his gaze. I'd suggest your Wednesday plans change. A long, flat silence. One of Brack's companions shifted his weight. The other found something to look at on the horizon. Brack looked at Leland, measuring. He found the kind of stillness that does not give him anything to work with. He touched the handle of his document case, nodded once in the way of a man concluding a meeting that did not go as planned, and drove out. Nobody spoke for a moment. The wind moved through the fence posts, the new ones, which did not flex. Aldrich, from behind Leland's shoulder, said quietly, That's the cleanest I've seen Brack leave a property. Leland glanced at Joanna. She had already turned toward the house. She walked back the way she had come, straight, unhurried, the ledger under her arm. Word moved through the county the way word does in a place where people pay attention to the land and what happens on it. By the end of that week, 2 neighboring operations had contacted Joanna to ask what had happened at her north gate. A woman managing her land alone, turning away a professional speculator with a registered leaseholder present, was not a common occurrence. People who live close to the ground notice uncommon occurrences. They note them. They tell others. Mira Sandell, the land registry clerk in Pincher Creek, stopped Leland in the parking lot of the municipal office 2 weeks later. Herd Brack left the Crest property empty-handed, Mira said. He did. She shook her head slowly. You know what you did, holding a lease on a young woman's land with a failing fence and no herd. What did I do? You made that property expensive to approach. Any speculator looking at it now has to factor in a registered agreement with your name on it. She paused. That's a protection most of those operations can't afford to test. That's the effect, Leland said. Mira looked at him for a moment. Most men in your position would have just made an offer themselves. She didn't want to sell. How did you know that? He thought about the fence posts she had been driving since dawn. The way she had answered his first question, maintaining it, not running it, with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they had and what it required. She was driving posts in heaved ground at 7 in the morning in April, he said. You don't do that over something you're undecided about. Mira was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in 12 years of recording transfers in this county, I don't think I've seen a man with your resources take no for an answer from a woman with nothing. She said it without ceremony. It landed the way plain things do when they are true. Leland rode out to the Crest property that afternoon. He found Joanna turning the south field for a fall cover crop. Oats and clover on a rotation she had mapped out in her father's ledger and was now executing alone, which was slow work with the equipment she had, but she was moving at a pace that would finish the section before the rain came. He told her what Mira had said. She listened without stopping the tractor, then idled it down when he finished. She sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel. She's right, Joanna said. That is unbelievable, not irony. Direct, the same way she said everything. Thank you, Leland. It was the first time she had used his first name. He drove back in the early evening with the Porcupine Hills going gold in the west, and the whole long bench of the Oldman Valley opening out below him, the way it had looked since before any of them had names on any of it. June moved through with the particular quality of a southern Alberta June, warm days and cold nights, and a light that came down from the Rockies clean and angled in a way that made everything look like it was being seen for the first time. Leland's cattle moved through the North Quarter twice that month. Joanna monitored the crossings as the lease required. Water level, bank compression, grazing pressure on the riparian strip. She recorded it in the operations ledger and sent the summaries to his office every 2 weeks. He replied in brief, precise notes that added information she had not asked for, a grazing pressure chart from his own records, historical water levels on the crossing, an observation about how the rock frame her father had built had been holding the bank in a way that was going to be worth documenting. It was a correspondence of facts that was, without either of them naming it, something else. He came in person on a Thursday in late June, ostensibly to check a section of the riparian strip ahead of the second cattle movement. He found Joanna crouched at the creek bank with a survey rod, measuring the compression profile at the crossing. Banks held better than I expected, she said without looking up. The rock deflector is redirecting the approach velocity. I want to document the profile now before the second push changes it. He crouched beside her. She was right about the velocity redirection. It was visible in the silt deposit pattern on the downstream side. It was the kind of observation that lived in attention rather than training. These records, he said. In 20 years, whoever runs this land will know exactly how this crossing behaves across full seasons. That knowledge usually disappears when the person holding it leaves. She looked at him. You've been thinking about who runs this land in 20 years. I have, he said. The creek moved past them, cold and steady from the snowmelt. The cottonwoods along the bank had come fully into leaf, that particular June green that only lasts 2 weeks before it deepens and settles. Miss Crest, Leland said, and there was something in the register of it. A careful formality that people use when the thing they're about to say matters, and they want to make sure the space around it is clear. I'd like to discuss whether the arrangement between us might take a different form. Something longer than a 6-week lease. She looked at him without looking away. You're talking about more than the land access. I am. She did not answer immediately. She had never answered anything that deserved consideration with anything less than consideration. She answered 3 days later. Saturday morning, frost still on the north slopes, the sky the particular pale blue that comes before the heat builds. She drove to Rockcroft and found him at the equipment shed, replacing a bearing on a swather head. He saw her coming and set the wrench down and waited. "I have conditions," she said. The expression that crossed his face was quiet and warm and did not oversell itself. "The Crest property stays registered separately. 160 acres in my name. My title." Agreed. "I manage the land records for both operations. My system, my notation, not a version of yours. That's an improvement on my system, and I don't become a supporting role. If we're running this together, I'm part of the decisions. Water, rotation, lease, all of it." He looked at her steadily. "I told Aldrich before the crew came that you'd know more about that land than any of them would. I said to listen when you spoke." He paused. "I knew what I was looking at in April." The silence between them held more weight than most sentences. "Then we're agreed," she said. She extended her hand. He shook it, firm and clean, the same as the first time at the fence line, and neither of them made more of it than that, because neither of them needed to. Autumn came the way it comes to the foothills, fast and with intention. The aspens went in a week and the grass cured out to its winter color, and the Rockies put on their first snow before the end of September, which everyone said was early, and which the old-timers said was normal, and both groups were right in their own way. The cover crop had come in well on the south field. The fence line had held through the whole grazing season without a failure. The creek crossing had shown no bank compression above the baseline she had documented in June, a fact that would mean something to whoever managed that crossing in 20 years, which was the point. On the first page of the new operations ledger, she had filled the old one to the last page in September. The header was simple and accurate. Rockcroft Crest, Oldman Bench, Autumn 1978. She was pulling the last of the garden brassicas when she heard Leland's truck in the yard. She looked up with the easy recognition of someone who knows the particular sound of a vehicle and finds it welcome. He came to the garden edge with his hands in his coat pockets. "Garlic in yet?" "Going in this afternoon." "Hardneck, same variety Dad grew." She straightened. "You're early," checking the south crossing before freeze. "Ice'll come in from the edges in another 2 weeks." "I know. I documented the freeze progression last year. It's in the spring summary. I read it." They stood in the October light, the foothills rolling away to the west, the Rockies behind them holding the first serious snow of the season. Two people who had built something careful, condition by condition, repair by repair, not from rescue, not from sentiment, from the clear-eyed recognition that some land and some work holds better when it's held by more than one pair of hands, provided the terms are honest and both parties have read every clause. There is a kind of wealth that doesn't show up in acreage or in the Rockcroft name on a truck door. It shows up in a fence line that held through its first full season, in a creek crossing documented well enough to be useful to people who haven't been born yet, in the handwriting of two people in a shared ledger, each notation precise, each one built on the understanding that the strongest agreements are not made from need or fear or the particular desperation of a cold April morning. They are made from respect and from the willingness to hear the conditions and write them down. Rockcroft Crest, Oldman Bench, registered and permanent. The deed did not need to be on the wall. Both of them knew exactly where it was. You've been riding with shadows of the lone West, where the West is told the way it actually was. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. Subscribe. The next story is already waiting.